World War I isn't lovingly called the Great War for no reason. The lore of this war is deep and complex. You could spend your entire life studying it instead of studying things that don't matter, like Elden Ring lore. The Great War is still important today because those who don't learn history are doomed to need it. Take for example the emotional siege of Premish, in which Austria-Hungary suffered the greatest loss in its history. Definitely don't repeat that. But the siege was part of their sus military decision-making under Conrad von Hotzendorf. Austria-Hungary was such a participant in the war that they were on the verge of collapse by 1917. The war ended in 1918, and spoilers, the Central Powers didn't win. The main reason the good guys failed is that American leadership was delusionally insane. They thought it was a good idea to sail a passenger ship into a war zone. They were shocked when the Lusitania was sunk, and now that I've sneakily introduced my three main topics like the opening paragraph of an essay, let's get to business. The year is 1914. Russia is fucking on Austria by inducing Napoleonic-level boogaloo retreats with human wave tactics. Russia's battle plan was straightforward. A right hook over Galicia, into Krakow, then march into Vienna. One small problem, the Austrian railway system was more mangled than the Balkans. For that reason, they had to take the impregnable fortress of Premish, a somewhat Polish, somewhat Ukrainian Catholic hotspot for hot maidens on Crocodile. For the sanity of Russian logisticians, they had to take Premish. God knows the Russians have logistic issues even today. From September 13th to 14, Premish was taking in hordes of refugees and multi-ethnic polyglot soldiers. That sounds familiar, sort of like today with Ukrainian refugees. Then, on the 16th of September, began the first siege of Premish, which is kind of boring. Mythical military genius Conrad von Hotzendorf steamrolled the Russian army all the way back to Warsaw, relieving the fortress on October 9th. But I did say that was the first siege. With endless waves of Asiatic reinforcements, the combined Austro-German army was forced back into German-occupied Poland from Russian-occupied Poland. On November 10th, the second siege began. Because of a bungled evacuation, there were still 30,000 civilians in Premish. The Russians desperately tried to capture the fortress multiple times during both sieges. All their attempts were miserable failures for two reasons. Orthodoxy is wrong, and they lacked the guns big enough to crack Premish's concrete. About 140,000 people were trapped in Premish, embargoed from international trade by the Russian army. Food became what was on everybody's mind, but not in their stomachs. People sold precious jewelry to get lean and crocodile. For my American audience, I would like you to imagine that gas had the same value as gold, sort of like Joe Biden's America, and you would be willing to destroy multiple Middle Eastern countries for Israel. Yes, that's how bad it was. Thankfully, the military genius of Conrad von Hotzendorf granted himself permission to let 1 month of the food supply be eaten during his Vichy-like campaign weeks earlier. Supplies were supposed to run out in January, but through sheer force of will, including slaughtering 10,000 horses, finding a store of magic beetroots in no man's land, taking food away from women, and inhumane rationing, they managed to stretch their supply until March 24th. Fat Russian spies among the officer class were ubiquitous. Among the monarchist Austro-Hungarian officers, there was basically no corruption at all. Traitorous Ukrainians gave up secret military passwords by trailing them in the snow, betraying the fatherland. The fortress was swarming with secret Tsarist officers with telephone connections to the outside world. Enemy troops even dressed up as women when on patrol. Fortress Commander Kuzminik personally decoded each telegram because the Russians knew everything sooner than the sub-sector commanders. Terminally traitorous, lazy, sick, Russophile spies avoided frontline work by giving themselves venereal diseases. A doctor complained that of the 58 officers he was treating, 57 of them were being treated for gonorrhea. As a food, prostitutes are high in protein. It builds muscle mass. After 5 months of starving, things were looking pretty grim. By March, the garrison was in an apathetic, zombie-like state. 25,000 people were hospitalized for disease from exhaustion and starvation. Many were delusionally insane. Being hospitalized meant lying down in bed and waiting to die because medical supplies, am I right? At this point, people were deserting like crazy. Although all the deserters were Russian spies, so they weren't really deserters. The Russians knew full well the state of the garrison and used psychological warfare. They dropped leaflets in no man's land for patrols to find. One leaflet, purporting to be from an Austrian POW, said, "This really can't be called imprisonment. As soon as we arrive, we walk free, and whosoever wishes can get employment and receives full board and a ruble a day." They also described in in scrumptious detail their meal plan. Tea with sugar for breakfast, a meaty soup with vegetables, and half a liter of wine for lunch, and then more meat with 500 grams of delicious bread every day for dinner. Pressed by the alarming amount of empty shelves, they were forced to take action. On March 18th, they launched a breakout attempt. In preparation, they somehow managed to make a full armored train. In short, their attempt was an absolute disaster. They made little progress, and because of the secrecy of the plan, the armored train crew didn't even manage to use their majestic murder machine. Kuzminich severely underestimated how much fight the soldiers had left in them. You know, after starving for 5 months and using their rifles as crutches to walk. The hungry Kuzminich then made the reasonable decision to surrender to obtain that Russian coochie, and also food. In negotiations, the Russian general who met them was livid about the destruction of the Austrian emergency lean supply and fortress, and demanded unconditional surrender. However, they agreed to a very important term. The officers got to keep their swords. Yeah, bravo! In total, 9 generals, 2,500 officers, and 117,000 other ranks became prisoners of war. When the Central Powers were dropping bombs on the city in the Gorlice-Tarnov offensive, it caused some fires. The Russians had trouble putting them out because they had deported all the firemen and policemen to Siberia. The Gorlice-Tarnov offensive was in large part orchestrated by Conrad von Hotzendorf, and that serves as a great essay-style transition to the next part. Doctrine of Command, Unity of Warfare. This is what separates mythical military genius Franz Conrad von Hotzendorf from every other commander. He was the greatest Austrian military commander since Eugene of Savoy. In fact, he was the most gifted general in all Habsburg history. Conrad was first married to Wilhelmine von Lebeau, whose name doesn't conform to French grammatical gender rules and who died in 1905. Conrad became maidenless. For 2 years after losing the love of his life, he was depressed. Then he met the love of his life. Conrad was on a mission in Trieste when he discovered Gina von Reiningshausen, like how Columbus discovered the New World, and unethical ways to pick cotton. The thing is, the Italian woman was already married to a wealthy industrialist, had 6 children, and her name didn't conform to Italian. Conrad was absolutely determined to marry Gina. He wouldn't take, "Sorry, I'm already married, lol," for an answer. Conrad von Chaddorf cucked Johann von Kuckinghausen by slamming his wife in bed. Joachim tolerated this because he was a beta male, more obsessed with Viennese prestige than living. Conrad continued to be based, and he proved to be a loyal friend zone for Gina. From 1907 to 1915, he wrote more than 3,000 schizo letters to her, many of which were over 60 pages long. He never sent them. Gina only found out about his manifesto after his death. The fact that Conrad spent considerable time every night writing letters to her, even during wartime, caused his staff to speculate about his sanity. Divorce in a Catholic monarchy was the legal equivalent of pulling teeth. The possibility of converting to Protestantism was refused by Conrad as a freethinker and atheist, and free-thinking atheist. Equally, he turned down the proposition to become a Hungarian citizen because who would want to be Hungarian, am I right? Owing to the fact that Hungarian matrimonial law was simpler, the solution was that Gina be adopted by a Hungarian Field Marshal Lieutenant. All one word. That conveyed the protection of Hungarian laws to Madame Reiningshausen. They married in 1915. Like Tifa's surprise debut in the Italian parliament, the marriage was considered improper and not polite. One guy even went out of his way to say to Conrad to his face that he did not recognize them as a married couple. Pretty ballsy. That guy lost his job. Conrad's social life isn't the only thing that's considered heckin' wholesome. Mono-minded on war, he wanted preemptive strikes against Serbia, Romania, and Italy. He petitioned the emperor to make war 30 times in 2 years. That's about 1.5 requests per month. Franz Ferdinand opposed Conrad von Chaddorf's neocon warmongering. Then the dumbass of Sarajevo gets like a Vrilo Princip jump scare. So Conrad had his war in 1914. In war, he took advice from VTubers. He only had 4 modes: attack, bash head against wall, and have affairs with other men's wives. His brilliance led to stunning victories at Krasnik and Komarov, but the retreat into Galicia wasn't a defeat, it was an act of inspired heroism. The 500,000 men he lost was just a skill issue. Pseudo-historians who slander Hotzendorf should instead focus on how the occupation of Galicia led to the greatest military military base moment in World War I, Premish, which became a symbol of brilliant Austro-Hungarian military planning. The press incessantly reminded the brave and loyal subjects of the empire that 117,000 men were starving hundreds of kilometers behind Russian lines for their freedom. In these circumstances, Conrad von Hotzendorf was basically forced to hop over the Carpathians and relieve Premish, undertaking 3 gruesome and grisly winter offensives. Oftentimes, the supply lines were so bad that Austrian soldiers used cardboard for the soles of their boots. During these attacks, Austrian casualties became so high that they lost track of the amount of people who were actually dying. You can't say that was a bad idea, you're not an expert. I trust the experts, especially Conrad von Hotzendorf. By the end of 1914, half of all Habsburg officers were dead. Commissioned officers and non-commissioned officers are pretty fucking important for running an army, and by the end of March 1915, the Habsburg army had half the men it had at the start of the war. At one point, Conrad confessed to his staff that if Archduke Franz Ferdinand were still alive, he would take the man responsible for such military disaster and have him shot. Clearly, he was referring to himself, but he was suffering from success. Later, he would be responsible for victories in Serbia and Italy, but a dick flattening in the Brusilov offensive. You see, Hotzendorf hated his German counterpart, Erich von Falkenhayn, because he did not brief him about Verdun. So Hotzendorf organized a punishment expedition in Italy alone, taking his best divisions away from the east. Then, Russian General Alexei Brusilov pulled a gamer move. From June 4th to September 20th, 1916, Russians swarmed over the Austrians. Whole units surrendered without resistance. Russia took hundreds of thousands of prisoners of war. Austria-Hungary was literally on the brink of total collapse. You can make the argument that Conrad indirectly caused Germany's loss at Verdun. And then, in 1917, for no reason at all, Emperor Charles II randomly dismissed Conrad. My diagnosis is skill issue. After the war, he became a bitter and depressed man, so suffered a severe disease of the gallbladder with icterus, died on August 25th, 1925, and for sure went to heaven. When he was buried, more than 100,000 mourners participated in observances. The primary reason he didn't end up a joyful and happy man is because of the United States.
Oh my God, if you're making linguistic laws, we're gonna quit. Well, because Quebec is Nazi.
Most countries have rational and thoroughly calculated geopolitical interests. The United States is not one of those countries. America's sole purpose as a nation is to ruin other countries with terror wars Americans call crusades for liberty and democracy. As proof, you can see today that America wants to bring freedom to Russia by destroying it like they did Iraq, Syria, or Afghanistan. Democracy, of course, means 500 megaton bombs and parasitic companies leeching money off of ordinary people. That's what they want for Russia, and that's what they did to Germany. Woodrow Wilson and American bankers, and most people today, didn't get the memo and were still rationally dedicated to their failed project of democracy. The liberal pigs running the failed states of America simply couldn't sleep at night knowing that there existed a better system where loyal subjects lived in harmony with their monarch, working in peace with God and family. In accordance with their pact they made with the devil, the liberals went to war to destroy Austria-Hungary in 1914. World War I was an ideological war fought between monarchy and democracy. American politicians were especially interested in this war. The abbreviation of the Central Powers is CP. CP as in cheese pizza. Cheese pizza as in another undesirable thing American politicians really like. America brought down the full force of its military inferiority complex so they could have more cheese pizza. Bankers funded the Allied death machine to defeat the glorious monarchies. Like with all human tragedy, banking and business elites wanted to profit off of it. JP Morgan himself received the proceeds of the first Liberty loan to pay off $400 million, which he in turn advanced to Great Britain at the outbreak of the war. The financial elite also created NGOs to spin lies about Germany. The Commission for Relief in Belgium made up grisly atrocity stories against the Germans, all of which were entirely false. The Carnegie Endowment for International Peace lobbied Washington for US entry into the war. The Rockefellers alone, who displayed great eagerness to punish Germany for merely existing, made in excess of $200 million. And if that wasn't enough, Bernard Baruch, Woodrow Wilson's right-hand murderous war profiteer, made a personal profit of $750,000. Woodrow Wilson, the president who made the atrocious Federal Reserve, unsurprisingly honored his death pledge to destroy monarchy, but not before some shenanigans. Pretty awful shenanigans. The Lusitania was a false flag operation committed by the government. If they didn't want the Lusitania to get sunk, maybe they shouldn't have loaded it with over 100 tons of war material and sailed it into a war zone. And then, when a U-boat was cruising towards it, not notify the crew, and for some inexplicable reason, the captain orders the ship to slow down. There is no doubt that they deliberately put the Lusitania in danger to entice America into war. Then, to the total shock of no one, America used the Lusitania as atrocity propaganda to convince Americans to intervene. Try and solve this math equation. A US battleship with 150 men gets sunk, 75 couples come up. Like, comment, and subscribe. The Great War was a tragedy because the right side didn't win. I mean, look at this unbiased poll conducted by me. 75% of people agree that the Central Powers were on the right side of history. To summarize all the topics covered more seriously, firstly, Premish is spelled like that. It's pronounced something like Premish, but Polish pronunciation is something far beyond any Anglophone can comprehend. On a practical level, the first siege was a success because it blocked the Russian supply system. The second siege was totally unnecessary as the Russians had no chance to push further into Austria. Secondly, Conrad von Hotzendorf had the right ideas, but he was hindered by his army. The Hungarians had refused to give permission to spend enough money to properly modernize it. That's not to excuse his horrendous failures, it's just to say that he could have done better if he was listened to years before the war. Thirdly, you should always remember this: bankers are scum. The entire banking industry should be dissolved immediately. However, there are deep-rooted factions that formed in the Great War who have a vested interest in robbing you forever. Follow me on Odyssey and Post, and Gab. You see, Hotzendorf hated his German counterpart.